So, welcome to Grow Country. I have with me today a couple of guests that I've been wanting to speak to for some time. We finally managed to find a time that worked for us to talk together. My guests today are Roberto de la Noval, who is an assistant professor of theology at Mount St. Mary's University, and received his PhD from Notre Dame in 2020. And Mark Roosien, who is a lecturer in liturgical studies at the Yale Institute of Sacred Music and received his PhD from Notre Dame in 2018. They collaborated together on the translation of Sergei Bulgakov's Spiritual Diaries. And have you had any other, either one of you can answer, what other collaborative work have you done or working on?
I don't believe we've done anything besides the spiritual diary that I
Okay,
remember.
okay.
We've thought about doing work together, and that seems like a distinct possibility, but so
Yeah,
far nothing concrete.
in the future,
In the future,
I
you do
think
plan
that
to
I think
collaborate again?
I
Okay,
see it. Yeah, I see it in our future.
okay.
Yes.
So then my first question to you is like, how did this work of collaboration, how did that come about? Like, what was the genesis of
Hmm.
that project?
Mark, do you want to kick it off?
Sure. Um, well, first of all, Nate, thanks for the invitation. It's great to be here on the podcast and talk to you and Rob and talk about Bulgakov, who's someone who's very close to me. Well, I think the genesis of the spiritual diary project was Rob was working on it. Rob has, I don't remember, maybe you can speak to this, Rob, but you were working on the spiritual diary kind of on the side as a side project and some other stuff you were doing. And you kind of threw it out there, hey, are you interested in doing this with me? And I was just finishing up another translation of Bulgakov, his book, The Eucharistic Sacrifice. And I thought, oh, I don't want to get into another book before I finish this one. But Rob sent me a few passages and I was so captivated by it that I just couldn't resist. And I said, yeah, I'll do it. And it became basically our COVID project because soon after that, COVID hit and we were all indoors all the time. So it was conducive for our weekly Zoom meetings that would last sometimes into the late hours where we would be going through this text together. And it was a great way to spend the pandemic, and it was a great way to connect with a dear friend in that time when it was hard to connect with friends. So we kind of bonded. We've known each other for a long time, but we definitely bonded further over this project.
Yeah, Mark and I met my first semester at Notre Dame. I came in for an early summer semester and was doing kind of a Greek refresher, and Mark was in there as well. So I remember meeting Mark there, and then our friendship just grew through we took a lot of classes together. So we knew each other at Notre Dame, and I knew you were Orthodox and moving sort of in the direction of ordination, and which you eventually did receive ordination as a presbyter, as a priest recently. So yeah, I was also wrapping up my own translation project, Sophiology of Death, and I just started doing the spiritual diary, and then I thought, hey, I want to do this with a friend. So we did, and it was a great time. And I think we met twice in person, maybe one person in that time near the end of the COVID
Yeah.
time, and just kind of wrapped it up, and then came out with Angelico Press, and we had a great experience with John Reese over at Angelico. So if anyone's looking for a place to publish, definitely recommend Angelico. It was really lovely to work with them. So that's kind of how we came to it. And I know, Mark, you mentioned that working on this diary was actually really influential in your own discernment, because at this point you were already a deacon, but
Right.
it was reading Bulgakov's own experience of being a priest that sort of, and I'm always interested to hear more about that, kind of what it was
Yeah.
that impacted you in that way.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I was ordained a deacon in the Orthodox Church in America specifically, in 2018, and I didn't have aspirations for further ordination to the priesthood, but it was one of those things where it seemed like maybe I should, but it wasn't. And people were telling me I should, and influential people in my life were telling me I should consider it, but I wasn't really interested. And then I don't know, having reading this book, The Spiritual Diary, it was written in some of the early years of Bulgakov's own priesthood. I mean, he had been a priest for over 5 years, I think, when he started this, but it was almost like he was coming to it for the first time in a new context, being in exile. And so a lot of his reflections in the diary have to do with the work of being a priest, ministering to people on their deathbed. There's many moving passages about being with people as they're dying, or being with people as they're sick, or just celebrating the services of the church, which kind of made it real for me in a way I hadn't experienced before. And he has such a depth of feeling and knowledge and a kind of intuition about the deeper meaning of all these things that it just made a lot of sense to me. And I felt like, I think I could do this if that's what God wants me to do. So I guess there's more I could say about that. But I think it was because I was so familiar with Bulgakov as an intellectual, and I had connected with him in that way, to see his inner life sort of filter through the work of a priest further solidified, I think, my understanding of him. And it's almost like he shared something with me in that process about this life of being a pastor and a priest, which I couldn't have gotten from any other source. Because I connected with him on such an intellectual level that going further and deeper into it with him was something that was really meaningful. I'll put it that way.
Yeah, one of my recurring conversation partners on Grail Country has been the cognitive scientist Dr. John Vervaeke, and he's a non-theist, but he's given one of the best explanations of agape that you will find. That he really deeply thought about it, and like specifically, like agape is that love which makes persons. Which so you can see how the pastoral role ends up being a deeply reflective of Bulgakov's theology, because that engagement and because that person making process is kind of central.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think one of the things I think that gets lost with Bulgakov's theology, and some interpreters sometimes, when they focus so much on his sophiology and the complications of his dogmatic thought, they forget that at the heart, Bulgakov is really a personalist. Bulgakov really stands for sort of the absolute value of the human being, and his understanding of sanctification and the Christian life is one of growing into the person that only you and no one else could be, in the specific way that you're made in the image of God. So for him, it's not some sort of transformation into something else. It's really a full flowering of one's personhood in the deepest sense. And so you can see how that in the spiritual diary, how this personalism can become a part of the way he ministered to people as a priest. He is seeking persons and their full, he wouldn't put it this way, but like reaching their full potential.
Well, yeah, sure.
A potential which is like infinite.
Well, that's one of the. That's what distinguishes like the notion of a person from a notion of an individual. The notion of a person is never in complete isolation. So you can see how like that process becomes both communal and pastoral.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's really. So how did you? So were you born Orthodox into the Orthodox tradition, or did you come to the Orthodox tradition later in life? What was your road into Orthodoxy?
I came to it later in life. I come from a kind of a Dutch enclave in West Michigan. So a lot of my upbringing was kind of around Dutch Reformed circles, but also my parents were kind of into the evangelical tradition by the time I came around. So I sort of had my foot in both kind of traditional Dutch Christian Reformed church and evangelical circles, but I don't know, I had a sort of typical journey of someone who kind of has the crisis of faith in high school, and says goodbye to all that by the time they get to college. But somebody invited me kind of at random, a friend of mine, to an Orthodox service, which happened to be Palm Sunday when I was in college. And it kind of blew my mind a little bit because it was so different from anything I'd experienced. I don't know if you've ever been to an Orthodox liturgy on Palm Sunday, but it's one of the biggest productions, let's say, of the year. There's lots of plants everywhere. There's processions. There's this kind of like buoyant childlikeness to the whole service because, you're sort of embodying the children who are welcoming Jesus as he comes to Jerusalem. So I sort of experienced that. I said, well, if this is church, maybe I could do this. I just didn't like I was just so tired of what I had been brought up with, I guess, in my, youthful kind of rebellion and stuff. But this seemed very intriguing to me. So, I just kept going and then started reading a lot of not just Orthodox theology, but a lot of ancient medieval philosophy, and things started fitting together for me. And I realized at some point that I had never actually been baptized growing up. And I thought, well, if I'm going to be a Christian, I should really get baptized. So why not be baptized in the Orthodox Church, since I've been going here for a couple of years? So that's kind of how it happened. And
so your particular branch of Reformed Christianity did not do infant baptism?
Well, this was kind of my parents' rebellion against
okay.
their childhood religion.
Okay, gotcha.
They didn't believe in infant baptism.
Gotcha. Okay.
So,
I think it is like, were you CRC?
My whole family is CRC.
Okay. I'm like surrounded by CRC people in my life, so.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good people. Great people.
Yeah, they are great people. Yeah. Yeah. It's just like, it's actually a funny thing that happened. I'd never heard of the CRC before I went to Iowa with my wife as a volunteer for the Yang campaign in early 2020. And the place where we were sent was a CRC like stronghold in northwestern Iowa. And so I'd never heard of it.
Yeah.
And so like ever since then, I just keep
the same people in Iowa.
I keep having more and more CRC people coming in my life, like ever since that event.
Yeah. No, I have a great love for the CRC. I have a great love for the evangelical traditions that I was exposed to as well. I never felt like joining the Orthodox Church was any kind of rejection. Really, it was a fulfillment of what I had been taught and what I'd been exposed to.
I can relate to the like being impressed like by the liturgy though, because for me, like I can remember when I was a freshman I went to the Evergreen State College, and when I was a freshman at the Evergreen State College, one of our instructors was Russian Orthodox, and she organized a field trip to a historic Russian Orthodox chapel in rural Washington State that had a old Slavonic liturgy once a month, because we were studying the Tale of Igor's campaign in the program at the time. So she wanted to set up a field trip for us to kind of get a feel for the culture. And I was just overwhelmed by and I was agnostic at the time, but I was just overwhelmed by the beauty of it. And so that's what struck me.
There's some old time Russian communities out there in Washington. So you probably got the real deal.
Yeah. So for you, how did you first encounter Bulgakov, and when did you know that Bulgakov was going to be an important figure for you?
Yeah, I actually encountered him even before I had become Orthodox. I was really interested in political philosophy, and I happened to come across, I don't know how, but I happened to come across his early work called The Philosophy of Economy, which is it's not really much about economics at all. It's really, I think it's more like a mystical economics, but it's a really interesting interpretation of like, what is human work and community for? And it's part of his journey away from sort of Marxian materialism into a kind of Christian idealism. And it's a really fascinating text, and I still think it's fantastic. But when I encountered it at the time, it made such a big impact on me for thinking about just, yeah, it had a big cosmic vision of what life was about, which included the church, which somehow managed to put the church together with political and social action in a way that I had never really encountered before, and I'm still trying to understand. So he came along for me very early in my journey as of sort of adult faith. And I was mostly interested in his political writings, and then later I became interested in his theology too.
That's great. How about you, Roberto? How did you you're Catholic, right?
I am, yeah.
Were you raised Catholic?
You know, I was baptized Roman Catholic. I come from Cuban immigrant parents in Miami, Florida. So I was baptized Catholic, but through a bunch of strange accidents of history that I won't go into, I was not raised Catholic. So I actually never went through any catechesis or anything like that. I was actually raised in a independent fundamentalist Baptist church. So a very different universe. But by the time I was in college, I was in the Episcopal Anglican world. And then in graduate school at Notre Dame, I returned to the Catholic Church. I suppose you could call it a reversion of sorts, at least in terms of my own history. But yeah, I'm Roman Catholic today.
Okay, so that's an interesting journey. So tell me about like tell me about like your experience like growing up in what type of Baptist did you say it was?
It was kind of an independent fundamentalist Baptist church. So it was
Okay.
it was
Was
intense.
it more like was it more Reformed Baptist or
Oh, not at all. So
okay,
deeply Arminian.
yeah, because you get like radical differences in theology amongst Baptists. Yeah, okay.
No, it was deeply Arminian in its
Okay.
kind of, yeah, very far from anything Reformed. Yeah, there were a couple Reformed people who would appear every so often. Because the thing is, I went to a school that was attached, was sort of a ministry of the church. So my whole life revolved around this one institution. So I was there Monday through Friday, but then I was very active in the church on Wednesdays and on Sundays. So I was there from the time I was 4 till I was 18. So that was kind of my world for a long time. Yeah.
Okay.
So,
but it sounds like you went. So you went. Did you go? So did you ever have a period of deconstruction at all, or you just kind of like because when you were telling the story, you said you kind of went from that to like Episcopal, and then eventually back to the Catholic faith that you were baptized into as a child. Was there kind of like was there a period of like deconstruction like in between? Or
yeah, so if I understand the way that word is used today, because I meet a lot of evangelicals who are using it. Maybe it's something in which your faith is kind of radically in question, usually as a result of some sort of intellectual leap forward in your life, and kind of have to put the pieces back together in some way. If that's the case, then yeah, definitely a lot of those. So not just one.
okay.
I expect there will probably be more in the future
Yeah.
if God is gracious. I'll keep getting the idol smashed and hopefully
Yes.
coming closer
Yes,
to
indeed.
Yeah,
something.
I'm glad you went there
Yeah.
because that's
Yes,
really
indeed.
what it is. What people call deconstruction is actually just the eradication of idols.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And so there was a lot there. I mean, so looking back now and really trusting in divine providence, um, as I'm learning to do, I can see that there was a lot of wisdom in divine wisdom placing me in that context. But for a long time, there was a lot of unhappiness about the severe intellectual limitations of that
Right.
tradition, and the kind of
Mm.
straitjacketing that was a kind of a policy.
Yeah.
So I mean, growing up, I was often told, don't read books that
Yep.
aren't the Bible. Like that's just going to puff you up with wisdom. Like knowledge puffs up, love builds up, etc. So there was a lot there, and I was really straining for something intellectual. I mean, I had a lot of doubts, a lot of questions, and thankfully the internet existed. So the internet was kind of my way to think my way out of this context, because there were really no intellectual mentors in
Right.
person that I could find to help me kind of think through these issues. And so I was very active back in the day on this website called Theology Web. This was, before Facebook, but it was kind of a forum where folks debated theology. And that just unveiled an entire world to me, you know.
Right.
I mean, I remember just realizing like, oh my God, I'm in a bubble. Like I had no idea I was in a bubble. I just thought this is Christianity, right? So that was really fascinating. Though most of the folks there were still evangelical broadly, though of course there I encountered kind of Calvinists and other folks, and then there were some folks who were reading some historical critical stuff. So somehow through that, I must have discovered, I think it was through that, but I discovered N.T. Wright. And N.T.
Okay.
Wright was sort of a life raft for me to kind of, you know, because I feared that, you know, a fully honest intellectual exploration of faith would lead me to agnosticism or atheism. But it seemed like N.T. Wright was a pretty smart guy. And, you know, he was able to kind of do an apologetics far more sophisticated than where I was. And through that, I just discovered the world of New Testament historical criticism. And so I'm very grateful to N.T. Wright to this day. I mean, he was definitely providentially placed in my life. And I got to meet him, and he was very kind. But it was through that I became more interested in I wanted to go do historical critical New Testament study. So at that point, when I got to college, I was encouraged by a number of people to go to either Bob Jones University or Pensacola Christian College. So universities that just would not have fostered my intellectual life in a significant way, you know, whatever other virtues they may have. And so I ended up going.
Sorry, I got to interrupt you, Rob, because one time I met this guy who was at the time a student of Bob Jones at Bob Jones. And this is back, I used to work at farmers markets in the Chicago area, and he was selling something. I'm blanking on what it was. But anyway, we were like next to each other that day at the farmers market. He was selling pesto, like really nice, fresh pesto.
Oh, that's interesting.
Anyway, it came out that he was a student at Bob Jones University. I was like, wow, I've never met anyone who actually went to Bob Jones. What is it like? And he said, it's like Disneyland for Christians.
That's interesting.
It just like stuck with me.
Disneyland for Christians.
And I just tried to understand, like, what does that mean?
Yeah.
I mean, Bob Jones was really attractive to me at that time because you could use different translations of the Bible. And so for me, that was
not just King James.
Yeah, not just King James. So for me, that was like a bastion of liberalism. You know, I just thought,
wow.
like, oh my goodness, like this is incredible. Wow. You know, so that
was
kind
like
of the
Disneyland.
World. Yeah, I think Christian Disneyland. So that's kind of the world that I was coming from. But at that point, I felt kind of a deep bitterness and towards that, and so I decided to go to Florida State University, where I could study with what I thought would be atheists, so that I could get the real skinny on, you know, religion and New Testament and stuff like that. So, you know, I went there and I had wonderful relationships with my professors there in the religion department, and my mind and world were deeply expanded. That's when I fell in with the Anglicans, Episcopalians, and also started meeting a number of Catholics. And so, yeah, I mean, there were crises of faith throughout and just developing in different ways, emotionally, intellectually. And then I ended up at Notre Dame for graduate school, where I met Mark. And at that point, it was, it just kind of made sense for me to become Catholic. I felt like, yeah, this is where I'm most at home. So, yeah, I mean, I think in many ways, I still retain a lot of kind of Protestant spirit in some ways. There's a lot I appreciate about Protestantism. And, you know, really, it was really fascinating when I was reading. I remember Mark and I took a course on John Chrysostom in grad school, and we were reading John Chrysostom, and I was like, this guy's just a fundamentalist Baptist. Like, it's just like the same deal, you know? So, you know, there's a lot that tradition is preserving in some ways from kind of certain strains of early Christianity. But yeah, so there was definitely those periods, and I'm right now, the synthesis that exists, I'm sure, is not a permanent one, but nonetheless, like I've grown to the point where I'm not so attached to the synthesis as much as I am, thank God, to like the reality of the Spirit in my life. So I trust that that will be refined, and I'm grateful for all the dialectical moments on the way.
Well, I think if you were to reach a place where you think that like it's done forever, then that would kind of represent the you know, that the person making process that's ongoing in you had ceased in some way, right? So the fact that you are coming to new ways of understanding continually is a sign that process is alive in you, I would say.
I hope so. And I mean, that is one of the great gifts of of life in the spirit, I think, is that the past continues to be given back to you in new ways. And that allows you to transcend the bitterness and even of your own failings. Like the
Right.
past, as marred as it is with sin, can really become a sacrament for you. And that's been true to my experience, thanks be to God. So
Just to be fair, I'll give you a little bit of my own. I was personally, I was raised Pentecostal, so not too dissimilar from your Baptist upbringing. Obviously, there's a lot of the charismatic element that goes along with it, but in terms of like general theology and approach to the Bible, pretty similar to Baptists, really. So that we have that in common. I was agnostic from a very young age, though. I was a person who always had questions, and the tradition that I was reared in did not really have many answers. So I went to, I mentioned that I started it at Evergreen. I ended up transferring from Evergreen to Thomas Aquinas College, which if anyone knows anything about Evergreen or Thomas Aquinas College, those things do not go together.
That's quite a shift.
Yeah,
Quite
that's a big shift. And so when I was at Thomas Aquinas College, I encountered like very intelligent Christians, Catholics, obviously, and that ended up I ended up basically becoming like a hardcore, like two-tiered Thomist. I converted to Catholicism in the mid 90s. And then deconstructed again. Just to like since that term is in the popular language, I just as well use it as any other. But like had a recurring bouts of agnosticism, shall we say. And then after I had gone through a divorce, I started reading David Bentley Hart like pretty voraciously. Like once I discovered David, I ended up reading like every book that he'd ever published and every freely available article I could find online. So and eventually I found myself returning to the faith. Barfield actually ended up being the thing that David made me like, oh, well, maybe I really am a Christian or could be a Christian. Like one of the reasons, I'm going to mention this because it leads directly into possible avenue of discussion. One of the reasons that I became an agnostic from a young age is that I am a instinctive universalist. Like there's no like everything about me rejects any other vision other than universalism. And for me, there was a particularly like emotional motivator for that because as I said, I was raised Pentecostal, but the people I was closest to in my life were my grandparents. And neither of my grandparents were Christians. My grandfather was like kind of a spiritual but not religious, non-church. He believed in God, but he didn't go to church. He had a very favorable opinion of Catholics because he had been cared for as a child with polio in a Catholic hospital. So he had he was very favorably disposed to Catholics, but he never like was a church person. He was a chef, blue collar guy, never really went to church. My grandmother, who I was also very close to, was raised Christian Scientist and just was kind of like, again, like spiritual but not religious. Very good people, like extraordinary people. And I love them deeply. And according to my parents' worldview, they were just straight up going to hell because they didn't have the right confession of faith. So when I was very, very young, I just tried to convert my grandparents at every opportunity. And then once I got old enough to actually begin having thoughts for myself, I was just like, that can't possibly be true. That's no vision of God that I can relate to at all. So I never really became an atheist, but I considered myself an agnostic because I had there were no other possible visions of God on the table for me. Right. So it really took me until my mid 40s when I'm reading a bunch of David Bentley Hart and start discovering like other possible ways of conceiving identity as a Christian, that it becomes evident to me that I've actually been a Christian all along. But it was not within, I had no conception of the possibility of being Christian in the way that I instinctively was. So that's that leads me into the question of, when you first encountered the idea of universalism in Bulgakov's writing, as someone who was raised in a fundamentalist Baptist tradition, were you already ready to accept an idea like that, or or did you find that challenging at first? How did you relate to it?
Yeah, I mean, like many other people who work in universalism today and write about this and think about it, David Bentley Hart was hugely instrumental in that for me. Of course, like I had studied early Christianity, so I was aware of Origen and Origen's universalism and things like that. But it was pretty much under the shroud, or under the cloud rather, of, this is heretical.
Right.
And already, I was really familiar with Balthasar's hopeful universalism, and I think that was just sort of where I landed. And especially being among Roman Catholics, I don't know too many Roman Catholics who aren't really hopeful universalists. I mean, the truth is, like, many of them don't ever really think about hell at all. I find that most of my co-religionists, it's just not really live in any sort of way. Maybe perhaps in moments of great sin or failure, that kind of fear can arise, but it's just not really a presence. I mean, one of the things that I think gave me a sort of unique way into these questions and like their implications was that for me, hell was real in a very similar way to how you were describing, right? I mean, I remember from the time I was a child, almost every single church service would end with, "Do you know today, without a shadow of a doubt, that if you were to die on your way home, you would be in heaven? Or would you go to hell?" And from a young age, I mean, this really did terrorize me. There were reasons for that too. I have a genetic illness, cystic fibrosis. And so death was on the horizon for me from a very early age too, because the life expectancy was much shorter when I was born than it is today. And thankfully today I'm doing very well, thanks be to God. But at that time, those two were a very potent psychological combination for me, right? The sense of like, I'm probably going to die soon. And where am I going to go? What's going to happen? And hell was so vivid. I mean, the way it was depicted in sermons, and I'll never forget this one sermon. There's this kind of symbolic, this problem of symbols in the New Testament, because hell is a place of outer darkness, but it's also a place of flames. So how is it possible for both of these to be true? And I remember one quite ingenious preacher saying, well, if you notice, really, really hot fire is blue. So if you kept going, right, to the hottest fire possible, it would probably be black. I just remember thinking as a kid in the pew, like, damn, that's pretty good. Well, of course, back then I didn't say damn. But so anyway, this was very live for me. And a verse from Ezekiel, I can't remember the chapter and verse, but kind of the warning to the watchmen that if the people die on your watch, their blood is on your hands. And I remember as a child feeling this immense pressure that everyone I met, I had to turn every conversation somehow to the sinner's prayer, to the Romans road, etc., because everyone I met, I just had to presume was on their way to hell. And of course, there was also that fear in myself that, did I really mean it when I said the sinner's prayer? And although it's always curious in some of these Protestant circles, the question of like, once saved, always saved, right? So are you secure in God once you've sort of said the sinner's prayer? In my church was definitely a once saved, always saved. So you couldn't lose your salvation. But even though works don't save you, works indicate whether you are in the faith. And so anytime there was sin in my life, there was this huge question, like, am I in the faith? Right. And so I got saved maybe 10 billion times, in the course of my childhood, just saying the sinner's prayer again and constantly examining, like, okay, did I feel the joy of the spirit in that moment? Is the spirit there? So in so many ways, this was like definitely helped cultivate a kind of neuroticism about the spiritual life, which took a long time to undo. And I still have those elements in my own spirituality for sure. But for me, hell is, I lived with it in a way. It wasn't this kind of abstract doctrine that sometimes when I hear people having debates about universalism, and especially when folks are really harsh against universalism, right? I just think, but you don't live in a way at all as if this is real. Like this is actually not potent for you imaginatively, psychologically, emotionally, right? You don't relate to people as if they're, just one breath away from being separated from God for eternity. Everyone is pretty much a practical universalist that I would meet in these circles. So it always puzzled me, why is universalism provoking these intense emotional reactions, right? When you actually look at the way folks are living their lives, it doesn't seem like they take hell very seriously at all. Anyway, of course, can't delve into the psychology of every person, but that's just as it seemed to me, right? Especially with the background, the contrast of my own background as a child and growing up in a fundamentalist Christian context, where really hell was really the main content of Christianity in a particular way. Like all of the gospel, all of God, it's all about solving this problem that we're going to hell. And discovering universalism, I mean, it was just a complete reconfiguration of all the same elements, but you got the same dots, but they're being drawn and connected in a very different way. And that was a really potent thing for me as someone developing in my own faith and thinking through these questions. So that's a little bit about how I came to it. I definitely would say I was very ready to begin thinking about these questions in a profound way. Yeah, that's what I'd say about that.
So when was it that you first encountered Bulgakov directly?
So I encountered Bulgakov as an undergraduate. I remember, I just finished my undergrad and I was interning as a campus minister for my Anglican college ministry at that time. And I was in Tallahassee, Florida. And I remember just playing around on the internet in my room. And I was on Amazon and I remember seeing the Relics and Miracles book. Amazon said, "You may like this." And I thought the cover was really gripping. So I clicked and I thought, sure, Orthodox stuff, that's cool. I was already kind of exploring Catholicism and Orthodoxy. So
yeah,
I read
Anglicans are often Orthodox curious. It's like there's a lot of
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I'm including myself in that. I'm also Anglican, and that definitely applies to me as well. So
absolutely, yeah. So that's how I discovered Bulgakov, and then I just kept reading him, throughout the years, and reading him and reading Dostoevsky kind of sent me to study Russian, and I studied in Moscow a couple times, and but then in graduate school it was my exam year, and I had originally intended to write a dissertation on the iconoclast controversy. I was quite interested in icons, even from as an undergraduate, kind of icon theology. That was such a different, because my tradition was deeply aniconic. So images were really important in my own developing spiritual life. But I had the side interest in Bulgakov, and I knew he was condemned as a heretic, and I wanted to read some of the texts around the condemnation. So I did a couple exam questions in my exam year on the Sophia affair, which is what Anglophone scholars call the whole dispute around Bulgakov's condemnations. And in that time, it was time for me to choose a dissertation project. And I just thought, man, this is where all my energy and passion went during the year. It was this question that I just kept returning to. So I thought, well, I'm probably not going to get a job anyway. So why not spend the next 2 to 3 years of my life living inside of this guy's brain? And what was fun was that after I finished living in his brain for 3 years, then Mark and I got to live in his heart for about a year or two. So yeah, that was my encounter with Bulgakov, and I'm really grateful to him, and I definitely see a lot of myself in him, and I'm certain that he's been an advocate in my life.
So yeah, let's give you a chance a little bit. I like what you just said there, and this could be either for Mark or Roberto, or both of you if you want to address it. So and working on the spiritual diaries and seeing what was the deepest connection you saw between the heart and the brain of Bulgakov while you were working on that translation.
Mark, do you want to jump in there?
Nothing is coming to my brain immediately. Do you have something?
And let me ponder it for a minute, because it's a beautiful question.
Sure. Good question. Okay, but here's something. One of the interesting things about the spiritual diary is Bulgakov's struggle with all the tragedy that he's experiencing. Personally, as an exile, it's an interesting time of his life where he's been kicked out of Russia, or it's become the Soviet Union. He's not yet settled in Paris, where he helps to found the Orthodox seminary there, and that's where he wrote all his major works, all his major theological works that we read today. So he's in this in-between period, and he is just trying to figure out why, and he's going through major personal crises. His wife is she comes to the edge of her deathbed, around the time he's writing this diary. His children are very sick. Some are in Russia. He can't reach them. So he's having a major personal crisis, and he's also kind of reflecting on the crisis in his homeland, where how is it that Russia had these, especially in the late 19th century, these aspirations among certain thinkers to be like, Russia will somehow save the world. Like, the West is crumbling, and Russia has somehow not been tainted with the sort of failures of Western culture, but has preserved the Christian faith kind of unsullied. And so Russia's going to come in and sort of save the day. You think of somebody like Vladimir Solovyov, who was a major influence on Bulgakov and so many thinkers of the late 19th, and I mean Dostoevsky, other thinkers of the late 19th and early 20th century, talking about this kind of cosmic mission of Russia. A lot of people really had that conviction, especially among Orthodox Russians. So here you have this, Bulgakov was kind of raised on that stuff in his Christianity. And here the whole thing crumbles. The church is decimated, it's persecuted, everybody's exiled, and Russia has gone completely atheist. So how do you make sense of this? And he's struggling both intellectually with that question, because it's really was a paradigm shift, I think, for him to come to grips with that. But also more personally, the kind of the link between the worldwide crisis and the personal crisis really comes to the fore in the spiritual diary in a way, where it's not just an intellectual exercise for him to ponder what is providence, how is providence operable in the world right now, how do we even see it when there's so much tragedy on a world scale, and also it's his own struggle too. Those two struggles, it's a deeply personal struggle, it's an intellectual struggle to understand providence. So I think it's really through his own, he's working out intellectual problems about providence through his own personal experiences of tragedy, and also overcoming tragedy, and his sense of comfort and finding meaning in pastoral work and in prayer and all these other things that he reflects on. So, I mean, there's a way in which you could say that the whole diary is a meeting of the intellectual and the personal. But I think that point about providence, both personal and global, is a kind of interesting lens to view that question.
Yeah, I love what you said, Mark. And to take it in a slightly different direction, I think about those encounters that he has at multiple churches when he says that he witnesses the Virgin weeping, right? Icons of the Virgin weeping. And later in his Mariology and in both the minor and the major trilogies, he has such a palpable sense of the Virgin Mary as the Theotokos' continuing connection with the world. Even in her dormition, she has not left the world. And I think this connects to the notion of providence. That providence isn't just the wise plan of God, though that appears very often in the diary as well, right? That there's this kind of Sophianic image of the whole world order, which is not just a kind of Noah's Ark of forms and their interconnections, but the particular events and their intelligible sequence, right? All of this is creaturely Sophia that manifests the divine. So everything that occurs, as he says over and over, God gives meetings, right? There are these providential nodes. And actually, the whole thing is providentially construed if you could just open your eyes to see it. But at times, the Spirit opens your eyes and you see it, right? And for him, it happens in these liturgies, or when he's on the train and he sees the foliage and the sunset and all of this kind of this transfiguration of the cosmos. The same thing, the weeping of the Virgin is the transfiguration of the icon in some way, right? And you see through the icon to how God is providentially caring for the world through the Virgin Mary, interceding, weeping on behalf of Russia, on behalf of Bulgakov, right? His prayer, please help my unworthy hand to write the right prayer. I mean, his doctrine of providence is so concrete, right? God is guiding the prayer that I will pray at this meeting, right? And I think that is a really, it's a beautiful thing because he speaks so often of the saints, and there's just this intimacy of the saints in the spiritual diary, that they're really with us. And in fact, as you were saying, like agapic love is that which completes persons. Their personhood and the epectasis of eternity carries on in their care for us individually, right? And I just think that's really exquisite. And of course, as Rowan Williams highlighted in the foreword to the book, the personal love of our guardian angels for us. And, you know, so you can see so many themes here that will be richly intellectually explored in the minor trilogy, right? With Burning Bush and then with On Jacob's Ladder and other texts. Bulgakov's universe is peopled with people, and a lot of those people you can't see at the moment.
Right.
But they're no less real for him. Like it is amazing what you say, Rob. Like the saints that he talks about are as real to him as the friends that he talks about in the diary too, which are like living persons in his life.
Yes. Yeah. So I think there the heart and the mind are just completely inextricable for him. I mean, it reminds me of one final comment on this point. Julia Reitlinger's reminiscences of Bulgakov at the end, and we had a great time translating those, and we really wanted to include them because it's so great to get an image of kind of Bulgakov as spiritual director,
right,
through her eyes. But that one passage where she mentions the story that was told to Bulgakov of the suffering children on the war front, and his question of, you know, where is God? How is God present in this? And the vexed questioning, right? That like, this is an intellectual problem, of course, but it's a problem that's so deeply felt for him, right? What do I say about this? And he says, here is where Christ is present, right? In the suffering. Christ's suffering is present in this moment, right? This is how I can say, Eucharist, thank you. This is how we can say thank you, even for this, in all things. How can you say thank you for this grave suffering? Well, this grave suffering is being, sorry, I just had a puppy come into the room. This grave suffering is being lived and experienced and borne by the crucified and risen Christ. And so for him, there's no intellectual problem that does not impact him deeply. And there's no deep emotional feeling that is not going to be, as he says in the Sophiology of Death essay, you know, when I was ill, it was difficult for me to run through my problematics in my mind, right? He was a guy who's, you know, he's being moved in a gurney or something in the hospital, right?
Yeah.
And he's just kind of thinking through like this antinomy, you know, but that's just who he was.
I was just going to mention the Sophiology of Death essay, Rob, because that essay, I think, in so many ways crystallizes, and it's so beautiful that it's one of his best writings, period, is that Sophiology of Death essay, which is the last part of your book, where he really does this incredibly deep exploration of the meaning of death and suffering and his connection with Christ's death and suffering, and how it's like, I don't know. It's hard for me to put into words other than just to say you should go read it. Every time I talk about this essay, I say just go read it, because
that's actually that's actually anyone who tells me where to start with Bulgakov, that's always the recommendation I give them. Like I agree entirely. It is. And for me, on a personal level, I was like the distinction he draws in that essay between dying and death
Yeah.
was something that I could relate to through personal experience, because I had very severe asthma when I was young. And I had, on one particular occasion when I was 14, I went into respiratory arrest and came very close to dying. The paramedics ended up arriving just at the right time, and ended up, but I actually, like, that transition point, like, I was beginning to pass through that threshold from the dying to the death. And like the experience of that threshold moment, like right before the paramedics arrive, like I actually know what that distinction feels like experientially. And it is, all I can say about it is that, like, I just had the overwhelming sensation that I had in that moment was everything will be fine.
Mm.
Like, that's everything will be fine was the overwhelming sensation. So,
It's really fascinating to hear you say that,
but
because
I had to let go. I had, in order to get for that transition point, I had to let go of the panic of the fact that I was dying, and oh my God, I'm going to die. I might actually die. And to be like, oh, I had to accept the fact that I was going to die before I had that experience of, yes, I am going to die and everything will be okay. And I didn't actually die in that moment, but I've had no actual fear of, I really have had no fear of death since that moment in my life because of that experience.
mm,
So that has allowed me to kind of live my life without having that fear of death hanging over me.
that's
So
remarkable. And it's really remarkable too, because I mean, that just gives you a different vantage into that essay,
yeah.
in a really
Yeah.
rich way. And
Yeah.
I mean, I'm definitely of that persuasion. And one of my good friends, from graduate school, has been kind of pushing me in this direction to just really take near-death experiences much more seriously as kind of empirical data
Yep.
on religion, right? And the claims of
Yeah.
religion, especially, what we say about the relationship between this world and the other world, which for Bulgakov, is not a relationship of so much of temporality, but a relationship of kind of nesting dolls of realities, right? And I think it's easy to forget sometimes that so much of Bulgakov's sprawling cosmos, right? I mean, look at his essay where he talks about what happened in Crimea when he had a near-death experience. I mean, he very clearly distinguishes what happens when he's younger, that near-death experience, from the dying, of the
Yes.
sociology of death,
Right.
right? In that near-death experience, he encounters his loved ones, right? And there's always an angelic guide,
Yep.
right? And this is so typical in so many near-death experiences, that there's either an individual being of light that sort of serves as a guide, or a council of them, right? That are leading people through these encounters and these memories, right? And you can really just put Bulgakov's experience up to some of these, right? I could just see him,
Mm-hmm.
kind of giving his testimony on the Other Side YouTube channel or something,
Yeah,
right?
sure, sure.
Describing what it's like,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And
Yeah.
and is it any surprise then that in his writings on angels and et cetera, there's just this vividness, right? Because he himself is looking at everything the tradition says and saying, yeah, I experienced that, actually.
I like the fact that you said empirical, Roberto, because one of the things that I've said many times, like definitely under the influence of Barfield, Steiner, and Tomberg, is that I have no problem with empiricism. The problem is that the empiricism that we think about usually when we're talking about being empirical brackets out half of our senses,
Yeah,
because we have
absolutely.
we have spiritual senses as well. And Tomberg refers to them as our spiritual sense of sight, hearing, and touch as being imagination, intuition, and inspiration.
Mm,
So if we pay attention to those spiritual senses as well as our physical senses, then we can indeed be empirical
mm,
and trust the information that we're receiving.
It's so interesting. So I've been a priest now for like 6 months, no, 7 or 8 months, and all of a sudden, you get really up close and personal with these kinds of empirical situations. And I mean, it's interesting talking about near-death experiences because almost everyone has had one. on some level. Maybe not almost everyone, but everyone maybe past a certain age has probably had one or something like that. And almost always it has been a moment of, it's been a turning point or a potential turning point for their life where they decided to make a change or do something different. And it's funny how in public conversation and in, you know, polite company, like these kinds of things are not really discussed. Near-death experiences and the things that you witness and the, you know, just the kind of phantasmagorical things that seem to happen. And yet they almost are the most real thing for a lot of people. They're like such a major impetus for making a major life change, reconnecting with a loved one. You know, like it's really quite remarkable. That's one of the things that about, you know, Bulgakov's diary of witnessing people dying. That's really, I've already had the opportunity to do this as a priest, and it is really, really real, you know. And I in my own life, I had a near-death experience that really changed the course of my life. So it's empirical stuff. I mean, even if it's not measurable, you know, in a scientific way, it's empirical in the deepest sense that it's like, it's something that made like a big concrete effect. You know, it pushed something out into the world that wasn't there before. It's very real. I mean, yeah, you can definitely theorize it in terms of spiritual senses, because how else could you experience this thing that's not measurable by, you know, laboratory instruments? But it's remarkable how real it is, and you know, it's the stuff of life.
Yeah, I mean, I've never used a laboratory instrument to sense my consciousness. Nothing is more real to me than my consciousness, right? Yeah, I mean,
and you've never used a laboratory instrument to evaluate your experience of the reality of another person either.
No, yeah, certainly not. Yeah, certainly not. But yeah, I think Bulgakov is amazing, and it's amazing how that already in your priesthood, Mark, that is something that you just have a proximity to now.
Yeah, there's this one person who keeps almost dying and then not. So I get a report from them every once in a while about their most recent near-death experience, and we just sort of talk it through, and it's almost very everyday the way we talk about it. It's like, well, here's what happened this time, Father. It's like, okay, wow, this is interesting. And this person, they also sort of step back from it and sort of witness it and talk about it in the same way they talk about what they had for breakfast, you know. Of course, with some more of a sense of awe, and it's very impactful for them, but it is just as real for them as anything else.
You know, it's interesting. I'm going to ask you a question that'll be somewhat controversial, but I'm going to ask it anyway because I think it's important. What do you think about the way in which psychedelics can help people overcome their fear of death? I would say potentially by awakening people to the reality of those spiritual senses. Like, what should the church's stance be toward that?
Are you asking me as a priest?
No, I don't want to get you in trouble. If you want to pass on that one, and I'll have Roberto, since Roberto is not a priest.
I have no personal experience with psychedelics, but I wouldn't recommend it to anybody. Certainly not as a spiritual direction. I wouldn't recommend it. The thing is, I have opinions about it, but I don't think they're well formed enough or well backed up to mention them in public on a podcast.
Fair enough.
I would just say I don't recommend it.
Yeah, you know, in my Cuban Spanish, whenever there's some kind of phenomenon that you are a little bit nervous about, but you know there's something there, you know, you just say lo respeto, like I respect it from a distance. That's kind of you know, maybe in English you'd say I have a healthy respect of that sort of thing, right? I think I have not reflected sufficiently on this. I've not read enough about it. I myself have never had any experience with psychedelics or anything like that. So I don't really feel informed to talk about it. I can say maybe something in a broad schematic. I could say something in line with, you know, to the extent that it unlocks certain states, those states, depending on the spiritual state of a person, can be for good or ill. And so to the extent that it's natural, right, it's to some extent a secular phenomenon. But then again, there's nothing that's just a secular phenomenon, right? Because we're spirits who are always ordered either towards God or away from God in any particular moment. And so that's kind of how I view it. Could this thing eventually be useful in certain contexts? Maybe. I would certainly would not advise anyone to go do it or anything like that. But I've heard positive experiences from people, and I know that there have been studies. I think Michael Pollan has written about this a little bit, and some other figures on helping people kind of have a rapprochement with death, especially people who have like stage 4 cancer.
Yeah.
And things like that. So I'm curious about it, but I really am totally not informed to talk about it.
Fair enough. I'm not a full-on advocate either. I mean, I went to Evergreen, so not surprising that I have some experience. So, but in my experiences personally were both positive and negative, and I think it is definitely something that should not be. Let me say this: it's fair to say this. It's something that should not be taken lightly, and I do not understand people who keep doing it over and over again, because that's definitely not spiritually helpful, because then you're just chasing an experience.
Yeah.
But I think it is something that I have seen for certain people. It is like it has unlocked certain things, and that has been able to stay with them throughout life. But those people don't tend to go back. They're like, I mean, like me myself, it's like, yeah, I did it in my 20s. I got what I needed out of it. I'm done. I don't need, I don't need to keep doing it over and over again. So definitely, I think like the pathway of like psychedelic enthusiasm is definitely a problem. But I wonder if the church weren't so close to the idea entirely, I wonder if there isn't a way that under certain circumstances and for certain people, we couldn't find a positive role. So I think that's
well, I guess I could say one thing more. Certainly in the Eastern Christian spiritual tradition, a state of really, like, let's say, heightened consciousness is discussed constantly, and it's usually the result of contemplative prayer. And what happens in that state is all kinds of wild stuff. You're exposed to all kinds of reality that it's hard to access otherwise. And there's so much writing about it because it's a liminal, and it's really a dangerous state, and it's very easy to fall under the influence of things that you're not able or trained well enough to actually apprehend whether they're for your good or ill. And the only way really to determine whether an experience you're having is for good or ill is to have a sense of total sobriety. The sort of higher part of the mind, which Evagrius calls the hegemonicon, that sort of the part by which you exert control over your passions, over yourself, has to be fully engaged in that moment. And what I'm concerned with when it comes to the path of psychedelics to transport one into that realm is that there's an inability to maintain a sense of sobriety that could control how you react to those spiritual realities.
That's good, Mark. Actually, I can see like that. I can actually bring us back to Bulgakov's theology here too, because this idea of like the creation of the Sophianic self is like very different from, say, like an Eastern tradition where you're like attempting to like just have an experience of no self, which I think psychedelics
totally
do
help
with, for sure. I mean, I can tell you from experience that's definitely the case. Psychedelics will give you an experience of they will give you the experience of unity, of the I am thatness, like where you feel your connection to everything else. It will give you that, but it comes at the complete loss of any sense of self. And so there's a way in which if what we are trying to, if what the Christian mission is to create the the true self, as opposed to overcoming the self entirely, that would explain why Christianity would have a different perspective on that.
Yeah.
Does that, I don't know if that's, is that helpful at all, or?
Yeah, I think there's something, and I think there's definitely something. I think the even let's say the most Rob used the word epictasis, kind of like continual going out from the self, which continues even after earthly death. You know, the goal of that is never actually ego death or the loss of the self or its total immersion into the sort of, you know, oceans of the Trinity, you know, where you lose your what Bulgakov calls your hypostaticity, your self, your personhood. It never,
Right.
your personhood is never supposed to go away. It only really grows and matures and becomes, you know, in the image of the one true hypostasis, you know, or the one true image, the proto image they called. So the experience of self, let's say, development it's not a minus, it's a plus at all times.
Right. Well, also it's interesting. So Tom Berg, in Meditations on the Tarot, he makes this interesting distinction where he talks about, like, a lot of the Eastern religions have this pathway of escape from what he calls the closed world of the serpent. So what the Eastern religions do is they offer you a pathway of escape from the closed circle, but what they don't do is actually open the closed circle into the spiral, which is what he sees resurrection as doing, as reopening the closed circle through the resurrection, so that it can be like the world that is open to God again. Because the closed world of the serpent is like, essentially, he tells this little, like, sort of like Platonic style myth of, like, how, like, that's related to the fall, of essentially that the serpent offering Adam and Eve a world that is like closed off from God entirely, and demonstrates this by swallowing his own tail. And that what the Eastern pathways offer through this experience of no self, or the higher self, is an escape from the closed circle, but it doesn't actually break open the circle in the way that the resurrection does.
I mean, I think it's worth, I think certainly, I mean, the medicinal use of these things and like their exploration in medical contexts, right? Testing, figuring out what's going on there, how it can help people. I know Johns Hopkins, near where I live, is doing a lot of stuff with psilocybin right now. And I think all these things are worthwhile and useful because at least one way to conceptualize what's going on, because I mean, I think an honest inquiry has to ask, why do some people in some context with these drugs seem to become more self-transcending persons afterwards, right? That's I think an honest question to ask. And I think one way to think about it is that if you take the tripartite anthropology of the New Testament seriously, and you think about kind of what these drugs do, especially I know some of these drugs kind of increase neuroplasticity at a really high level for brief periods of time. And this is why it can help people with depression, because there are these sort of neurochemical ruts, right, that a number of people are in. And having experiences while things are more loose, let's say, can allow you to rewire. This is actually the same theory behind things like EMDR, right? So there's something in some ways, let's say, maybe offensive to our dignity of rational mind, thinking like, how could having buzzers, right, or moving my eyes allow me to achieve a sort of greater emotional integration or healing? But it's because we are this tripart compound, right? And I imagine that those medicines or drugs that touch us right at that nerve center between soma and psyche, right, mind and body, right, can really have powerful effects. But as Christians, I would say we are particularly interested not just in soma and psyche, but in the power of pneuma, spirit, right?
Yeah,
and the
right.
Holy Spirit working in us, right? And it's the Holy Spirit that also impacts those lower manifolds. You could say the lower levels. And psyche, even if it's well integrated, right, doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be integrated towards virtue, right?
Mhm.
Right.
And
Yeah. No, that's
yeah,
right. And in fact, one of the things that occurs to me as you were saying that, Roberto, is that so you can take psychedelics and it will cause a permanent increase in your openness and a big five personality indicate like demonstrably so. But you know what is going to increase your openness even more? Love. So however powerful psychedelics might be for opening up a person, the love is far more powerful. So
Love is
there's
harder to
that.
get, harder to do.
it's not illegal, but it's harder to get.
It's harder to get.
Harder to
Yeah,
get.
it's true.
Hard to get your
Yeah,
hands
it's
on it.
true. Yeah.
I've got a plug. His name's Jesus.
Amen.
And
Yeah.
now to this episode's sponsor, Jesus.
I would hope of every
Keep that love.
episode. Yeah, thank you. That's great. Oh, that's fantastic. Yeah, I'm sorry.
That was youth group vibe, youth group pastor vibes.
Yeah.
I know a plug.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, so yeah. I didn't mean to derail the conversation with it. Was just because we were talking about death and it's like and near death experiences, and I'm like, so it's like, oh yeah, there's like psychedelics seem to help people overcome their fear of death. Like, should I ask that?
The conversation was just shrooming, you could say.
Yeah.
We're putting a cap on it,
Yeah.
you know, because
Yeah.
you're a fun guy, but maybe let's go to another topic, you know.
Yeah. So okay, I'm gonna completely shift gears, and this is actually gonna be more for Mark because, or excuse me, more for Roberto, because it's a question about one of the essays in Sociology of Death. One of the essays in Sociology of Death that also made it a very big impression on me was Bulgakov's essay on conditionalism, and the way he starts that essay is really interesting. And I think, having come out of a very like biblically oriented tradition, like both of you, um ultimately, if you're going to talk about universalism with people who come from those kinds of tradition, they're going to want biblical proof texts. And the way, what's interesting though is that Bulgakov acknowledges how good the exegesis is of people who hold a conditionalist position. So what would you say to someone who is in that place where it's like they have gotten themselves to through dedicated reading of the Bible to accept a conditionalist position? Like, what would be the thing that you would say to them to make them consider that universalism might be a better alternative to reading the same text?
Well, I mean, I agree with Bulgakov that there's something really respectable about conditionalism. But I do think that the Pauline passages about God's universal victory are really important. And, I think it's difficult to square God's universal victory with conditional immortality or annihilationism. So I think Bulgakov does a good job of kind of pointing, Bulgakov has his critiques of their exegesis of things like the wages of sin is death. And he says, you can't read these things in such a crassly literal way. And I think those are good arguments as well. I mean, clearly the New Testament implies a life beyond the grave. Of course, some annihilationists say there's a life beyond the grave for a while, but then the resurrection of the dead is simply for annihilation. I've never myself been able quite to square why God would raise people from the dead just to immediately annihilate them again. This has always seemed rather odd to me as a theological position, right? But what I think is important about the notion of God's victory, and this gets to any Christian eschatology, you're going to ask the question at some point, what would it mean in your view for God to win? Right? So for God to really be victorious against the forces of evil. And I think for many Christians throughout history, an adequate answer has been something like, the forces will acknowledge that God is Lord, power, submission. But I do think Origen, right there in On First Principles, in his beautiful section on the omnipotence of God, says, well, what it means for God to be omnipotent is for God to be able to subject all things to himself. But we see the real image of that subjection in Christ's subjection to the Father, both in his life and in 1 Corinthians 15, where he subjects the whole kingdom to himself, really. And then later in Gregory of Nyssa's interpretation, right, the whole cosmos to himself. And so for me, what's really compelling about Bulgakov's arguments there is he says, can you really imagine that God is victorious if certain people that he's made in his image, right, no longer perdure to be in that blessed kingdom, right? That if you affirm that, then it leads to a really interesting protological question,
Right.
which it says, which I think every view wants to say God wins. But if you think about it in the three views, right, in the infernalist view, how does God win if there are people who are forever separated from God in a conscious state? Well, you can cash this out in two ways. You can cash it out in a kind of predestinarian way. God wins because God predestined them to be the shadow by which the light would always be reflected eternally, or the light would appear more beautiful, right? So a kind of chiaroscuro sort of theodicy. Or in its more contemporary form, a free will defense, you say, well, God wins by allowing people to have their way. But then that ultimately raises the further question, well, clearly he's not winning if he's letting them have their way, because their way is eternal rebellion against God. So if you really go deep into the logic, you have to say, well, God wins because God's goal in creation was to set up a sort of moral tournament where certain people would have to choose to make a fundamental option for or against God. God is sort of indifferent to whatever any individual may choose, right? You could say, well, God wins if there's a certain proportion of people who chose for God over those who chose against God, though most of the tradition has affirmed that, at least in the West, right, the Augustinian tradition, that's actually a minority of people who will be those that chose for God. But it seems to me a very odd theological claim to say that God is victorious. The victory that the New Testament manifests is simply just God saying, I set up the conditions and people made choices and free will was actualized, right? That doesn't seem to me at all what the victory of the New Testament is. But that's what many people in the kind of free will defense of hell will say, well, there's no problem here. God is victorious because God got what God wanted out of the universe, namely the play of freedom. But that's not what the New Testament says. And it seems to really go against even New Testament notions of judgment, right? Kind of a C.S. Lewis, people doing what they want for eternity, is not what New Testament judgment looks like. New Testament judgment is severe, right? And this is something that's missed very often in kind of pop dismissals of universalism. Oh, so everybody gets in there at the end, huh? No problem. Right?
Yeah,
it's
right.
like, well, no, there's a severe judgment that occurs, but then go beyond it, as Bulgakov says. Look at these passages like Philippians 2. Look at these passages like 1 Corinthians 15, where people are joyously exclaiming, Christ is Lord, right? In those instances, it seems like God is victorious when people repent and when they come to joy in salvation.
You might like this, Roberto. Tomberg says something very interesting in Meditations on Matero, and he uses a real world illustration of what he's talking about. He says that the true meaning of conquest is the transformation of an enemy into a friend. Because until that point, the enemy is not truly conquered, but merely defeated. And he gives as an example Germany at the end of the First World War, which was clearly defeated, but as opposed to Germany at the end of the Second World War, which is truly conquered because the former enemy has been transformed into a friend. And then he then goes on to say that ultimately God's conquest of evil has to involve the voice of Satan joining the chorus of angels. So
that's certainly Bulgakov's view. Absolutely. Right. And I think it's cogent and powerful. I think universalism and its rise right now in Christian consciousness, definitely David Hart has kind of put this in everyone's conversation now, right, in a really potent way. And if people say, look, I don't feel comfortable going there, right, because I respect the weight of the tradition and I want to stay in a more hopeful universalist place, I think that's respectable on some level, of course, right? But to understand that there is a beautiful logic, right, that does great justice to much of the New Testament, right, in this picture flowing from Origen all the way to Bulgakov, and Bulgakov's voluminous defense of this view. I think the view certainly deserves that level of respect, for sure. And I think it's incumbent on folks who are sympathetic to it to present it really in this kind of conversation of, what is it that we want to say about God, and why have some of these saints in church history, some of these figures like Gregory of Nyssa, right, and others, seen this question as one about God's victory? How do we think about God's victory? And then how do we think about God's victory in our life? Do we feel like God is victorious most when we're being punished for our sin, or when we're fully repentant? And kind of using that data of religious experience, just how we were talking about the data of near-death experiences, right, to help us understand the images and symbols of eschatology in the New Testament, because they're integrally connected, right? My submission and my subjection
Well,
to
I
Christ
think there's a way
now,
in which that kind of view of God's victory is is a result of, Tomberg, I think quite correctly points to idolatry of power as the root of all idolatry. And so what that kind of view of victory is a kind of projection of our own idolatry of power onto God.
yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I mean, for Christians, the redefinition of power, right? What is the power of God? Christ crucified, right? That is what power means to us. And at least I think that's what the New Testament sort of gives us, right? The still small voice, and the still small voice of the Spirit converting us, right? Making us more open in that kind of subjection that's not a psychedelic expanse, but is a real kind of giving over of ourselves in love. Yeah, I think it's really important to tie our experience. And I mean, I've learned so much of this from Jordan Daniel Wood, my friend, who speaks so often about, and I know he's been on your
Yeah, he's
show
our
as
mutual
well.
friend. Jordan is the
Yeah, mutual
greatest. Yeah.
friend. Yeah, and
Yeah.
he speaks so beautifully about this question of, like, was I more or less free when I was converted, when I gave myself away, right? And there really is a sweet subjection in repentance, right? That you feel in some sense, yes, I'm the one repenting, but also you have this profound sense of, this is God conquering something in me, right? And every time it's new, like the Lord's mercies are new every morning. Every time you have a deeper
Well,
conversion.
that ties directly to this interesting notion that Tomberg has of the ultimate of the real, like, esoteric meaning of conquest being the transformation of becoming a friend.
Yeah.
So you're no longer you are no longer an enemy but a friend, and that is the true meaning of conquest.
Yeah.
I'm reminded.
Yeah, go ahead, Mark.
I'm reminded. I was going to say, in this conversation, I'm reminded of an older essay by David Hart called "Christ and Nothing."
Yes.
And where he kind of makes this. He kind of and he says this in Beauty of the Infinite too, about, like, there's basically really two main options here, especially when it comes to this question of power. Power as conquest or power as the cross. And he says that Nietzsche is really the premier kind of theorist of a theory of power. And as you said, Rob, you were saying the sweet submission. I'm hearing Nietzsche just like barfing right now, because this is exactly the kind of thing that he was totally opposed to, because he didn't understand it, or because his theory of power was just so radically opposite of the Christian understanding of it. And I think David, does such a good job in that particular essay, but also, like, throughout the Beauty of the Infinite, of kind of making that point of we're really dealing with two completely different things here, and it's a helpful thing to actually separate an understanding of power, which is about submission of others, about conquest, about defeat, right? Versus one which is about making friends, and not so you can lord it over them, but to truly, like, submit to one another.
Yeah.
You know, that's like anathema to someone like Nietzsche, and yet that's like exactly what we're dealing with in the cause.
Yeah, interesting enough, also Tomberg also take in letter 11 on Meditations on Matero, he which is on force, he actually links that letter to the power of the Virgin, which is completely non-coercive. even though it's a reflection on force, it's actually the power of like non-coercive love. So
yeah, Bulgakov has beautiful things to say about that in Bride of the Lamb and in some of the essays in Sophiology of Death, and then her role in the Eucharistic sacrifice as well. You know, Mary, I think it's in the Akathist, right? The Great Akathist, like terror of demons, something like that, right? But why is she terrifying to the demons? Because she is, you know, this sweet submission to the Lord's will that brings our salvation, and it is the model for every Christian to submit in the same way. But I wanted to say one quick thing about the friend of God thing. I had my pastor in college, Anglican priest, a beautiful man and a great mentor to me, Father John. He would always say, 2 Corinthians, I think it's 5:9, something like that. God was in Christ reconciling the world to himself. Not Christ was reconciling God to the world. He said, no. God was in Christ reconciling the world to himself, right? Or while we were yet sinners, while we were enemies of God, Christ died for us, right? That God has always been our friend, right? He created us to be his friend, right? To be, you know, friends of the Trinity, as Bulgakov says, right? This is why he overflows from the Trinity to make other persons to join in the love of divine Sophia. But we're the ones who project and believe that God is against us. And in many ways, like our fear of judgment, of God's judgment, is correct, right? Because there is a me that needs to die, right? That is inimical to friendship with God, right? And it's not, you don't get that ecstatic union with God without that death, as Bulgakov says over and over in the spiritual diary, right? That like the cross, right? The cross is the path to glorification, right? I mean, I'm just thinking now about like self-emptying as you know, can really can feel like an ego death, right? Because you're so attached to these notions of yourself and these images of yourself and these feelings and these ways of being in the world. And in sanctification, they can be stripped away in a way that you think there's going to be nothing left, right? But then that's the miracle of Sophianic creation, where you realize, oh, actually, this is what I've always been and what I always wanted to be. You know?
Yeah, I was just to that point, Rob. I was just reading today in Bulgakov's book, The Friend of the Bridegroom, which is his book on John the Baptist, and I'm reading it mostly because the Sunday I'm preaching about John the Baptist, the Sunday after Epiphany or Theophany, you know, in the Orthodox Church, January 6th is about the baptism of Christ. So the day after is always about John the Baptist, who does the baptizing. So I thought it would be good to brush up on Bulgakov by reading some of that. And in the first couple of pages, you know, he says, John the Baptist is the greatest saint ever, just second behind the Virgin Mary. That's why you have on any Orthodox iconostasis, you've got Christ, the Virgin, and you've got John the Baptist. It's like non-negotiable.
Yeah, he said he's the angel man.
That's right. He's got wings. Sometimes he's carrying his own head on a platter. And he says the reason he's the greatest saint is because he had given himself entirely to another. Like in the Orthodox tradition, St. John is called the forerunner. He's that who goes before the one who is to come. So his entire mission in life, not just outwardly, but Bulgakov makes the point, it's like his own inward motivation was to efface himself. You know, he must increase and I must decrease. And so he talks about it as though it is a kind of, it's almost like a death of the self. And yet he is also, as Jesus says, you know, the greatest of those born of women. So it's like, it's the paradox of the complete loss of self becomes the complete restoration of who you are.
And I think too, to add to that, what is John the Baptist's first encounter with Christ? It's an encounter of joy in the womb.
Right.
Yeah.
You know, he leaps for joy. And it's, I think, behind every sacrifice, every self-immolation, every death of the self, there's something in us that's leaping for joy for like what we are going to become because we've encountered Christ. You know, I think sometimes this sort of, you know, I must decrease so he must decrease can be read in a negative or even taught in a negative psychological register. But that misses that John the Baptist's self-abnegation is born of joy, right?
Yeah.
Literally, he's
and
born.
that's what Nietzsche didn't understand, I think.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
That's what, you know, he accused Christians, they have no joy. That was their greatest fault.
Right. Yeah.
So in some ways, you know, he was right, because Christians often do. They do take this like, they don't understand the joy themselves, but it's, you know, that's not the whole picture.
Right. Yeah, actually, yeah, that's interesting. Like, it's one of the things that caught my attention in the spiritual diary was the reflection on despair. And like, I will say this here, in my negative like psychedelic experiences that touched on what I can only refer to as the demonic, that is the emotion that those powers are always pushing. That is what they want you to give into. And so yeah, it's just like that. So that particularly struck me, because that's something that I've had to wrestle with. And here's the funny thing though, is that in my day-to-day life, I am not prone. I'm not at all prone to depression. I'm not at all prone to despair. I am pretty like even-keeled, happy-go-lucky, joyful person. But in those moments, like there's a confrontation with that like despair. And I think there's like, that's one of the reasons I think that we could talk about, like, you know, the intersection between, like, say, our modern psychological understanding of mental illness and the traditional understanding of the demonic for a moment here, because one of the most common fears of schizophrenics that have any kind of Christian background is a fear of blasphemy against the Holy Spirit. Like, it becomes like an obsession that they just can't get out of their minds, and they just return to that over and over again, which obviously pushes them toward this kind of despair. So do either of you have thoughts on that?
Rob?
Well, I mean, it is obviously such a massive topic, right? The relationship between kind of the monastic spiritual tradition and our modern psychological traditions, of which there are so many, right? I mean, depends if you're talking kind of from the cognitive behavioral world or the Freudian psychodynamic world and all of the different schools there. But I know there's been work by Orthodox thinkers on kind of bringing these two traditions together into dialogue. Yeah, so I mean, I think it's just a rich area for exploration, and I think it's kind of what I mentioned earlier about the tripartite anthropology, that I do believe that we've had, you know, quantum leaps forward in understanding the psyche and psychic processes, right? In the last 100 years, I do think the discovery of the unconscious is, you know, a real development in human history that needs to be taken really seriously. And of course, there are great debates about exactly what the unconscious is, and right, the debates between Freud and Jung, and all sorts of other developments streaming from those diverse traditions. But nonetheless, I do think it stands kind of as a fact that our understanding of psyche, right, the mind, is much richer. Nonetheless, I don't think that collapses everything that came earlier in the tradition into that, right? And so just as there are laws of psyche, right, there are laws of pneuma too. There are laws of the pneumatic spirit. And I do believe that what the monastic fathers are on about and understanding, you know, goes beyond just psychic processes, even as it still unfolds them. And can there be breakdowns at the psychical level that make the life of spirit more difficult to live? Yes. Can there be breakdowns on the bodily level that make the life of psyche more difficult to live? Yes. And so are we prone to confuse things that should be carefully distinguished? Yes. Are we prone to completely disassociate things that can't be neatly disentangled? Yes. And so I believe that anytime it comes to questions of spiritual direction and psychology, I mean, I know this happens quite often in spiritual direction. Somebody will say, I think you need, I mean, this happened in my own life, right? Kind of discussing spiritual issues. And somebody will say, I think these are some more psychological issues that need kind of a psychological approach. And then even in psychological arenas where someone will say, well, I think there's some biochemical issues that need to be addressed. And really, I think what Christians have to offer and what are the richness of our monastic traditions and ascetical traditions have to offer is to say, yes, we embrace the totality of all knowledge about the human person, body, soul, and spirit. And we constantly seek new syntheses and new integration, right? That will, to use the Chalcedonian formula, right? Like unmixed, but not separated, right? And that's kind of how I view these sorts of things. So when it comes to any particular person, I would be very hesitant to speak about, but I think broadly, this is the right and helpful framework, I believe. I'm curious what Mark thinks about this and what you think about it, Nate, as well.
Yeah, I don't know if I have that many thoughts, except that there's a sort of moment of recognition when you realize, I guess speaking from my own experience, that there's a difference between spiritual advice and spiritual health and mental health. And the spiritual guide there's a boundary that they should not traverse because it ends up mixing in an unhelpful way. Not that they're not related. I think, Rob, you said it well, that like, there's certain ways in which like the problems with the psyche can be interacting with problems of the pneuma. But it is important, I think it's important to know the difference and to know when one is outside of their area of competency. And also to know what people are actually asking about if they're asking for help. That's actually pretty hard to do when someone is suffering, because these things are very hard to disentangle. I think, Nate, you gave the example of schizophrenics kind of having a problem with an obsession with not blaspheming the Holy Spirit. It's like, is that really a spiritual problem? It's difficult to say. On the face of it, it seems like the most spiritual problem because it's like the one unforgivable sin, and it's raised to this like, very high level of like risk and kind of, it's just a massive claim. So, but on the other hand, it's like spiritually, from a spiritual perspective, it is the person's probably missing the point entirely, about what's going on with that. So I don't know. My thoughts are inchoate on this.
No, that's fine. That's fine. It was a sort of I'm sorry with all my off the wall things, but I just kind of go where my intuition leads me.
No, it's good.
So a couple thoughts. I read this interesting essay a while back that was written by actually a psychiatrist who was born in Africa, but was schooled in the West. And he practiced psychiatry in the West for a long time. He eventually returned to where he was from in Africa and was actually like working within his original like tribal culture. And the part of the tribal belief system was very much had a strong belief in evil spirits. And so essentially what he started doing was practicing his modern psychiatry alongside the traditional shamanic practices of the tribe at the same time. And he found that people like benefited from using both approaches. So that was very interesting. And then the other thing I would say is that I don't think it's possible to be a good therapist if you're not practicing agape. Like you have to, like in some way, you have to be invested in the person forming process of your client in order to do your job. And that obviously you don't want to cross the line into other less appropriate forms of love that are not appropriate for that role. So you would not want to you would not to you wouldn't want to cross into, obviously you don't want to have any kind of erotic anything, you don't want to have like a friendship type kind of relationship, but that kind of like that agape, which is essentially most closely related to parental love and this person forming process, like you have, like if you don't have that as a therapist, I don't see how you're going to help anybody.
Yeah, I think that's true, and I think from the other side, something that is quite remarkable is there's a really great book. I think his name is Terry Cooper. It's called Sin, Pride, and Self-Acceptance, and it's sort of an analysis of the doctrine of original sin in light of, and especially pride as the original sin, in light of the psychotherapist Karen Horney's understanding of neurotic conflict in the person. So it's kind of like Niebuhr and Horney in conversation. And it's a really excellent book. But one of the things he talks about, and I'll never forget, so he says, there's really something miraculous in any moment of psychological healing. So take somebody, for example, who from a young age has been really internalized a really wicked sense of self from parents who treated them poorly, bad experiences formative in childhood. And they really do think that they are kind of unworthy of love and meaningless, right? And yet, you think of the mountains of evidence that you have from your life, right? Years of parental abuse and neglect, right? Friends who have failed, et cetera. And then through this relationship, right? And the steadiness and constancy of this psychotherapist, right? Listening to you, telling you the truth, which is always an act of love, right? We can do it in a cruel way, but most therapists, of course, aren't interested in that. They're interested in telling the truth in a way that builds up. Somehow, this person internalizes the what Carl Rogers called the unconditional positive regard
Mhm.
of the therapist and believes it, right? Believes not as a datum, but believes it, with their soul, with their heart, right? That I am lovable and I am loved. And Terry Cooper says this is always something remarkable because when you think about it, if you just stack the evidence, right? Well, here's, 20 years of people telling me I'm not lovable and acting in this way. And here's 1 year of this person, just one person, right? Loving me in this personal way within the constraints of this utterly unique relationship, right? But nonetheless, I was able to internalize that regard and it begins to talk back to all those other voices. And eventually it just becomes how I view myself, how I experience myself. And Terry Cooper says, in some way, that person who says, no, what your parents told you about yourself or what your experiences, what you drew from your experiences, that was not true. I am telling you the truth about yourself, right? You are lovable. You are good, right? You deserve good things, etc. In some sense, that person is standing in the place of God. And that anyone should believe that after all of those years of abuse and neglect is truly a miracle of grace.
Yeah, especially if we take the idea of God as Father like seriously. That's precise because because that's what you're doing. You're like reparenting someone who is damaged because they were parented poorly by their actual parents. That is like the case in almost all therapeutic situations. That's normally the case. That's normally the situation you're dealing with. And to a certain extent, like, our human parents are all flawed. And so to a certain extent, all of us were, parented poorly to a certain degree because none of us perfectly reflects that agapic love in the way that God does. But obviously some people do a better job than others. So yeah.
Yeah, and I say all this, of course, like not as a psychotherapist. I mean, it's a
Yeah,
profession
sure,
I
that's fine.
respect
That's fine.
deeply. Once again, I respect from a
Yeah,
distance, but
yeah,
I do think that there are profound moments of grace and transformation, and it I do believe that if anybody ever changes towards self transcendence and love, it's because grace is at work.
yeah.
So I do believe grace is at work in those contexts.
Great. Do either of you have any questions for me?
Yeah, I'm curious about what Bulgakov has meant to you, as you've developed as a thinker and as a
Sure.
Christian. And, yeah.
So, I mean, unsurprisingly, I learned of Bulgakov's existence through David when I first started reading David, and so, and also John Milbank, who also I've read quite a bit of, and I immediately like fell in love and started doing content, related to Bulgakov's work and reading more and more, and I mean, it just aligned with kind of like the kind of vision of what it means to be a Christian that I already kind of like stumbled into through the various pathways that led me back to the faith. So, yeah.
I have one question for you, Nate.
Sure.
Tell me about the guitar behind you
It's
and
my
what you
son.
do with it.
It's my son's. Alas, it's
Okay.
my son's. I don't play at
So
all.
it's not your
No,
instrument.
no, that's not my instrument. It's my son's guitar. Yeah.
How old
I
is your
do.
son?
My son's 24.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. He's he's on the autism spectrum, and he's making big progress and becoming self-sufficient, but he's not there yet, so he still lives with us. So, good kid.
Where do you see Grail Country going in the next couple of years? Like, where's it come, and where do you see it going?
So I kind of like I started it because, I just wanted to have I'm very dedicated to having conversations. Obviously tough. Like, that's what I'm really about. And I think that there's something about like having like meaningful conversations and deep conversations that um can get like kind of through where you can get people out of like talking in their set kind of talking points. If you can get those kinds of conversations where people like just get out of their fixed patterns of thought and start to actually like genuinely exchange ideas, you can have like these moments of like insight and synthesis. So I think that kind of thing is valuable in and of itself. And so that's pretty much what Real Country has been dedicated to from the beginning, and continue to I hope to continue to have like to give people a chance to like have these like genuine encounters and like get to know a little bit about each other, get stretch each other's thinking a little bit, exchange ideas, and
That's great.
yeah.
I
So,
did not see myself talking about psychedelics today.
right.
So
I didn't know it was going to happen either. Like I
yeah,
said, I just kind of like.
it's been quite a trip, let's say. Uh, so I'm glad we tripped onto this.
No, you're
Yeah,
the king of puns. You're the absolute king of puns.
I affirm eternal punishment.
I don't know
So
how you do it day
yeah,
in, day out, and I know it's a hard job, but
it's
Okay, let's yeah, Tomberg does that too, by the way. The same trick.
yeah.
Yeah. I want to know how you do it though.
Oh, I
Tomberg
mean,
kind of Tomberg kind of follows Berdyaev's lead and kind of
oh, I
like,
was making a joke about eternal punishment.
oh,
I
punishment. Oh, I thought you were saying that you were for, because that's what that Tomberg like was a very devout Catholic. And
yeah.
he has a clear doctrine. He's clearly a universalist. I mean, he believes in the final redemption of even Satan, but at the same time, he affirms eternal hell. But he kind of like he follows Berdyaev's lead in sort of like redefining what eternal might mean.
Yeah, I mean, I think at least for those in the Catholic world who are interested in this sort of question, I think Justin Sean Coyle's essay on Al Kimmel's blog, "May a Catholic Endorse Universalism," is quite interesting. And for my part, I just think it's really great to get universalist thought out there and to put it in dialogue. The thought and have Christians have serious questions about who do we believe God is, and what are God's purposes for our lives, and how does our vision of postmortem judgment, for example, impact what we think about post this life, intraworldly punishment, right? I think that's a really big thing in Bulgakov's own thought. as well, right? His notion about the afterlife is sort of this like complex prison, or like an eternal death sentence or an eternal life sentence, for hell. And Bulgakov was a great opponent of the death penalty, as were many of these Russian Silver Age thinkers, Solovyov most famously. So I think you see some of that thought in Pope Francis today too, who speaks about any punishment that bars repentance as being fundamentally against the dignity of God, which is why Pope Francis has come out even against life sentences. And I myself am really interested in this restorative justice question, and I'm happy to partner with a beautiful organization in Tallahassee, Florida. I was just there yesterday, called Joseph House, and it's a place that's a re-entry home for men leaving prison, and really trying to show them their human dignity and allow them a re-entry into society. And just thinking about the cruel and unusual nature of punishment in America and in other places. And I think for Christians, we can ask, do we believe that God is a God of cruel and unusual punishment? And what does it do to the human spirit to imagine that there's no possibility of change or healing or repentance? So for my part, I think these universalist discussions are really fruitful for all sorts of conversations. And I think just to wrap up really quickly, what's important is really dialogue between Christians who have different views on this question, and kind of assuming that people are coming at this with goodwill, trying to understand the scriptures, trying to be faithful to tradition, and trying to think through the questions that are arising for us today. I think there's a lot more common ground between folks, even if they don't end up affirming, universalism or the same position. But if we can come closer through these conversations, I think they will have been useful.
I recently had a conversation with a Christian Reformed pastor who's a very good friend of mine. His name Paul Vanderclay, and it was hosted on another channel. And basically, that's kind of like what we tried to do in that discussion, was to give space for considering what the possibilities are, and to like, at least that's basically what I was trying to advocate for in that conversation, is universalism has to at least be considered on the table and part of the conversation. It can't just be like immediately like bracketed out as not a possible view. So it went pretty well, but we're already friends, so it was cordial. Mark, you're Orthodox, so a little bit less of a direct issue for you. Although there certainly are plenty of hardline folks within the Orthodox camp. When when people like say, oh, Bulgakov, he was a heretic, why would you study Bulgakov? Like, how do you respond to that?
Well, he wasn't condemned a heretic by the whole church. His condemnations were biased, and I think people, if they're honest with the information, they know that. And I think anybody who gives him a shot will realize that there's a lot of really incredibly insightful things in his work, even if they feel that he was misguided on some issues. So I think those who don't want to touch him because of this pollution of the accusations of heresy I just don't think they're very intellectually honest. So on the other hand, I don't think he's for everybody. Like, I wouldn't recommend him as like a first Orthodox thinker for most people, unless they've really digested a lot of the broader Christian tradition, because he's working almost on a meta theological level a lot of the time. He's translating a theological idiom which was worked out for 1500 years into a brand new kind of way of talking and thinking about it. Especially at the time, it was very brand new for a guy that was so conversant in the language of German idealism and Platonism and Neoplatonism, to present the Christian faith in this way was so new at the time, that unless you've been instructed in some of that stuff, or just known more broadly about the Christian tradition and can understand what kind of interventions he's trying to make, it's not always a great place to start. On the other hand, he does have a really good book called The Orthodox Church, which was a book that he wrote for a popular audience. And I would recommend that to anybody. In fact, I think it's actually one of the I want to do a paper someday about all the 20th century books called the Orthodox Church, because I think there's like 8 of them.
Sure.
And they all do something different with like trying to introduce Orthodox Christianity to the world. That's all their stated purpose for each of these books. His is definitely the most theological, but it's the most, I think, it presents this tradition in like, I think the most honest, but also the most beautiful possible way for a newcomer. So that's my one caveat. If you're new to Bulgakov, you know, I go with that book first, maybe. But if you're an intellectual and you know the Christian tradition very well, I would probably, Rob, you mentioned Relics and Miracles.
Yeah, I think that's a great opener.
I actually, I taught a class this semester at Yale Divinity School. We read that book as a part of a class on sacraments and sacramentality. And that was a great place to start. So, but again, we had read other stuff, and these are folks at Divinity School. They've already been instructed a lot in the Christian tradition. So, sorry, it's a long-winded answer, but I don't believe, like Berdyaev, I don't believe in necessarily burning the books of heretics.
Right. Right.
You know,
Right.
in some ways you have to understand, and I'm not saying he is a heretic, but you have to understand what the heretic said sometimes in order to understand more clearly what the truth is.
Yeah.
And if I can shamelessly plug, I hope in 2024, maybe early 2025, to finally submit my revised dissertation to a publisher. And my dissertation is totally on, like, completely about the condemnations of Bulgakov. So I think it'll be kind of the first really in-depth treatment that's not insanely partisan. There's a couple short.
Being a Catholic gives you a little bit of distance from
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
but,
I mean,
but I just
having read your dissertation, Rob, like there are some good arguments that his opponents.
Yes.
Some
absolutely.
are better than others. Some of them are pretty bad, but there are some good ones that are. I mean, I think you just have to take. You have to take all of it. You have to take him as seriously as his interlocutors, and be as intellectually honest as possible.
Yeah, I mean, he was a person who was working things out, and it would be curious to know if he had kept living, how some things would have developed for him. But that he was a profound pastor and a brilliant Christian mind for the 20th century, I think is just simply undeniable. And the thing is, he was condemned by 2 ecclesiastical jurisdictions, but his own ecclesiastical jurisdiction did an investigation, and he was cleared of the charges of heresy in his own 1937 in his own. And as they wrote at that time, the report said Bulgakov may be in error in a number of places, but there is no way that he is a heretic. And I think that's a good concluding note. Besides really encouraging Mark, since it's 2024 New Year's resolution, to start working on that article on the 8 Orthodox Church, because I want to read that.
Yeah, maybe one day.
I would enjoy that. Friends, I unfortunately have to depart because I have been driving from Miami back home, and I spent a lot of hours in the car today, and I'm fading.
Yes, I want to respect both. Thank you both for joining me today. It's been a wonderful conversation. You're both welcome back anytime.
Thank you.
And wish you best of luck going forward in your endeavors. Thank you for taking the time to join me today. It was a wonderful conversation.
Thanks, Nate. It was a great
You're both
conversation.
delightful.
God
Thank
bless.
you.
Take care.
Yep. Bye-bye.
Take care.